A young music producer has just seen a production of Jesus Christ Superstar and was hit by his muse. He wandered the streets of Manhattan, unable to sleep. A native of France, Alain Boublil, felt he had to keep walking until he found a theme that could match the power and emotional intensity of what he'd just seen, and something uniquely French. He came to the defining national moment, the French Revolution. That idea would develop into a rock opera, then a concept album, and finally transform into what has been rightly called the most successful musical of all time, in a show that has been seen by 70 million people in 44 countries and translated into 22 languages. It has been a hit everywhere except France. Why? The second turn would see Boublil trade the muse for a mentor. The original production was about the French Revolution, but it was not based on Victor Hugo's famous book. That would take inspiration from Hugo's cross-channel counterpart, Charles Dickens. Boublil walked into a production of the quintessentially English show Oliver and walked out inspired to base the production on Les Miserables. Incredibly enough, that show will be produced by the same man who was running the production of Oliver, which is only a couple of the two incredible connections between England and France. The production of Victor Hugo's masterpiece will, in the end, depend not on France's greatest novelist, but England's greatest author. How does the production of Les Miserables depend as much on William Shakespeare as Victor Hugo? We will trace all these fascinating paths of lineage on this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. All right, it is happening. Please take a moment, if you could, to share or repost. The word of mouth is an absolutely crucial way that podcasts live or die. We are getting some momentum if we can sustain it. I think this is going to be an ongoing, long-term, successful project, but I will need your help. I, do scattershot research, but I've found enough to know that having the people who are listening to the show tell other people about the show is one of the most important ways the podcast can happen. So the future is in your hands. If you could do me a solid, just go ahead and put a good word out there on whatever social media you use. Second announcement is that the references have been in the show notes, but it turns out they're getting too long. So now I'm putting them at the end of the transcripts. If you're interested in the footnotes and the references, and I hope you are, you can find those at the bottom of the transcripts. We are now in the home stretch for Les Miserables. So our agenda is we'll talk about early adaptations of the show. We'll talk about the creation of the musical, and then that will leave us with two great questions that we will get to. The first one is it cool to get really rich off a story about the really poor? And how true is the musical to the book? And a related question of that is, why is it that the most French of French stories is not gone over well in France? All right, we will get to those probably in the next episode, but we'll start right now, the early adaptations of the book into something that is a theatrical production of some sort. Okay, the first thing to know is there are lots and lots of adaptations. According to the Wikipedia page, which I'm not presenting as definitive, but which is quite good for a quick flavor, there are 14 book sequels listed by authors other than Hugo, 7 comic book series starting in 1943 and last appearing in 2010, 9 different manga series starting in 1963, but most of them after 2000, 23 different TV series, including one in Japanese and a couple by the BBC, 11 different animated versions, including the Soviet-Latvian animated short. I'm going to say that again, just to let it sink in. Soviet-Latvian animated short. There is one of those of Les Mis, and 13 different radio series, including the obligatory BBC treatment, and also a 7-part series by Orson Welles on the same radio series where he did War of the Worlds. Like everyone else, Wikipedia says that the 1960s TV series The Fugitive is based on the story. So I'm not going to cover all of that, but true to my promise of doing scattershot research, I'll focus on the adaptations that seem important or have a good mystery or backstory, and that will lead us right up to the musical. All right. My main source here is Catherine Grossman, who we've met before. Grossman wrote a 1996 book about the novel and what it means. And in 2015, she co-edited a compilation book. That's one where there's an editor or two, and then there's a bunch of experts, and they all submit a chapter. The co-editor was Bradley Stevens, who specializes in French at Bristol University. And the 2015 book focuses on adaptations of the novel. So Grossman's original book was about the novel itself. The 2015 edited book is about adaptations. And so Stevens and Grossman co-authored an introduction to the book, and they each wrote a chapter separately. So there is a total of 3 different chapters by those 2 authors in their book. Grossman's solo chapters, chapter 7, is about the early reception in the United States. And that is what I will be relying on for this first section here. According to Grossman, there are stage adaptations of the show almost immediately. The book is released in 1862, and by 1863, Charles Hugo, Victor's son, gets author credit for a stage play in Brussels. The stage production can't be done in France because Hugo is in exile, and while the book is popular, Louis Napoleon, who's ruling France at the time, wants Victor dead, so it's a risky proposition to stage a showing in France. Charles, we learned in earlier episodes, had some tension with his father, but he also served as the medium of the seances that the family held in 1852 and 53. It was good enough, the stage production that Charles had put together, that it ran on and off as late as 1899, where Charles collaborated with the co-author. It ran for packed houses. Actually, I don't think Charles was alive in 1899, but the show that he started was still getting run as late as the turn of the century. The book was famously popular in the United States, especially among Civil War combatants, although the South had to edit out the parts about slavery being bad, which, if I understand the situation correctly, is still what Florida and Texas are doing with their history textbooks. Anyway, by 1863, there are a number of stage productions of the story in the United States, and some of them, interestingly, incorporate music and songs. I made Continental Leap there, but Charles Hugo is doing stage productions in France as early as 1863, within a year of the release of the book, and in the United States, across the Atlantic Ocean, there are also stage productions that are going also as early as 1863. As a curious side note, this book was banned in Philadelphia in 1897. That is the book Les Mis, because it involved a child out of wedlock and a woman in prostitution. Don't get any ideas. Texas and Florida, your students aren't going to read Les Miserables, and those aren't books you need to ban, or I guess Huntington Beach. It is a great book. Anyway, the ban was short-lived and it was atypical, but it happened. That gets us to about 1900. Between 1900 and 1909, there are some more successful stage productions in the United States, including student theater companies running performances and a bunch of touring shows. One of those touring shows starred a guy named James Hackett, went for 4 years. One starred a different actor named Wilton Lacaya, Lackaye. He was a big name in his day, and he started a tour in Waterbury, Connecticut. But the show had so much heat, its opening in Connecticut was mentioned in papers in Anaconda, Montana. I don't know, and it doesn't matter whether this has any historical significance. Nobody should ever miss a chance to mention that there is a city in Montana that is named Anaconda. That itself sounds like the title to a musical just to play around with that slant rhyme. Anaconda, Montana. Maybe I'll go write that song right now. That could be the next great musical, could start right now. Okay, but get this. One of the reviews read, and I'm now quoting directly, quote, "The effective use of incidental music in connection with this play suggests that a good opera might be built upon Les Miserables. That author nailed it, and without the benefit of any seance anyway. The successful traveling theater shows were giving Les Mis a life beyond the novel in that very first decade of the 20th century. And rewinding just a bit, in 1897, cinema was just getting launched, and 2 guys named Lumiere, is that awesome? The Lumiere brothers were making some of the very first films, and they actually did a short version, like 5 minutes of Les Mis. But by 1909, so a decade later, there are now 20,000 movie theaters in the United States. And the film adaptation to know about is the 1913 version by a French actor named Albert Capellani. He made a full-length version of Les Mis. It is released in multiple cities at once. It has sophisticated advanced publicity, and it doesn't matter that the actors are French because it's a silent film and the subtitles are all in English. That movie was a, quote, unheard of success. And, quote, those are Grossman's words. 70,000 people saw it in St. Louis in 16 days. 116,000 people saw it in Chicago. In San Francisco, every showing sold out. Plus, they had to turn away 500 people every evening. It ran for 5 years and was rightly called, quote, the most successful motion picture production ever made, end quote. In 1918, it was eventually shortened and moved out of the grand theaters into smaller, more affordable venues, and that gave it a second life. And part of the appeal was that it was shot in France, and those who had family members serving in World War I were interested in the scenes of the French countryside where their relatives were fighting the war. It was followed immediately by an American version of the film, which was also phenomenally successful. And there are a couple takeaway points from this, but two that are interesting to me are, first of all, that Les Mis is a story that's not only crucial to the making of the modern novel. It was the most successful novel in France, and it was the first big international blockbuster, but it's also crucial to the creation of the movie industry. It was one of the very first and most successful, like the Star Wars of its day. If you went to see a movie, you'd probably gone to see that one. And then the second takeaway point is that it shows this book could be adapted into theater and film, which of course it will be famously in 1980, just 70 years later. But that is quite a start for Les Mis getting adapted from the novel into stage performances. By the 1920s, there were more silent films of interest. Hugo's Hunchback of Notre Dame is made with Lon Chaney Sr. as its star, and it's a big hit. And after that, of course, Chaney will star in Phantom of the Opera. We're connecting a bunch of past episodes now, but Hugo's book was already a massive hit, and he'd already had some other stuff that had been made into some of the most recognizable operas of all time, including Rigoletto and Lucretia Borgia. But the silent movie of The Phantom was crucial to the success of both the book and the musical. I won't rehash all the old episodes here, but if you haven't heard the backstory of the silent movie version of Phantom, it's definitely worth the time. For now, it's just an interesting contrast, whereas the silent movie version of Phantom was the key to keeping that narrative alive for the musical to happen. The silent movie version of Les Mis wasn't necessary for the book. That book was going to do just fine on its own, but was more crucial to the development of the entire movie industry. And it's interesting that both Hugo's novels, an interesting connection that gets us from Victor Hugo to the Phantom of the Opera is that Hugo's book, his book Les Mis, becomes one of the first big silent film smash hits. Then that makes Hunchback of Notre Dame, another Victor Hugo book, a key vehicle for Lon Chaney, which gives him the juice to then produce Phantom of the Opera in 1925. And because Phantom of the Opera succeeds as a silent movie, it's around to be made into a musical later on. Okay. According to Stevens and Grossman, in their introductory chapter, there would eventually be 65 film versions, and according to those authors, that makes it the most popular screen adaptation by a 4-to-1 margin over any other competitor. It's one of the most adapted stories of all time. So, if you are a French music producer and you are wandering the streets of Manhattan in the late 1960s, you have definitely heard of the French Revolution. You are definitely aware both that Les Mis is the most successful novel of all time, and quite probably you are aware that it has been a huge success in cinema, which gets us to that fateful night on Broadway. Our second main topic here is the development of the musical. Now, my source here shifts from Grossman and Stevens to Jessica Sternfeld in 2006. Jessica Sternfeld has a PhD in musicology from Princeton. She wrote a book that is called Mega Musical, and I'm relying heavily here on her chapter that she wrote about Les Mis. Alain Boublil, Boublil, I can't for the life of me get the French. He was born in Tunisia to a Jewish family. He moved to Paris at the age of 18. And after seeing the West Side Story in 1959, he pursued a career in music. He eventually got work in radio stations and became a music producer. But his big walk down the road to Damascus came in the late 1960s or the very early 1970s when he saw Jesus Christ Superstar. He is moved and the muses are screaming in his ear. He walks around in a trance-like state, the same condition that Charles Hugo was in when the spirit of civilization told him in a seance that his father should finish the novel Les Mis. Here's the quote. He felt an overwhelming compulsion to keep walking until he thought of a suitable theme for a rock opera that might compare in scope and intensity with the subject matter of Jesus Christ Superstar. Inspiration came at dawn. Why not deal with the single most important event in French history, the French Revolution? end quote. And I said, there's a bunch of pronouns in there. That's, of course, talking about Boublil and not about Charles Hugo. It would be awesome, though, if the spirit of civilization told Charles Hugo, hey, man, go make a rock opera. In fact, that was I'm imagining here that is what Alain Boublil's muse was telling him. That is the account, in fact, that Grossman has, or Sternfeld. That account is in Sternfeld, but the footnote is to a book by Baer, which is sort of the promo book, equivalent to the promo book that Andrew Lloyd Webber made for Les Mis. When Andrew Lloyd Webber made the Phantom, he had a coffee table book that is the official version of the show that was commissioned by the producers, and that's what Baer's book is to Les Mis. All sources have perspective, okay? And if you had the misfortune of taking an argumentation class from me, I would be telling you should always identify the perspective of your source. That doesn't discredit their account, but the author's own version is likely to be very favorable for the author. You should always know the perspective that your source is coming from just to evaluate what it's got to say. But let's notice two things about it. He's not drawn to Les Miserables, but to the French Revolution, and he's centering it on France. And for our purposes, the inspiration is mystically inspired. All right, so Alain Boublil has the moment with his muse. At dawn, it comes to him, I'm going to make a rock opera about the French Revolution. So he finds a composer named Claude Michael Schoenberg. There are umlauts over the O, and another couple of collaborators. And together they write a play that is called La Révolution en France. My French is bad, but I can translate that one. That is the French Revolution in English. It's a rock opera, so the music is more traditional rock band with the drum kit and electric guitars. It opens in 1973 at a venue called the Palais des Sports, P-A-L-A-S, D-E-S, and then just the word sports in English. I'm not sure how you say that in French, but that is one of the theaters in France. The album releases in advance, and it does well, and the show runs for a successful season. It is not a mega hit, and France is not producing any of those. One season run that is successful is a credible success for a French theater, but it's nothing like the scale of a Broadway run. So time passes, and Boublil now goes to see a production of Oliver, which is produced by Cameron Mackintosh. If you know musical theater, that's a name as familiar as Tom Seaver's to baseball fans. Let's just put a pin in that for now, or better yet, let's write it on a Post-it note and stick it on the edge of our collective computer screen. According to an author named Hughes, I'll introduce you in a second. Mackintosh is living the binge and purge lifestyle of the entertainment industry. Between 1967 and 1981, he is periodically flush and broke in regular cycles, but he does have a production of Oliver, and Boublil sees that. So Boublil walks into the theater, watches the show, and he's taken with the character of the Artful Dodger. As a Mets fan, I cringe at any mention of the word Dodger, and have never really forgiven Orel Hershiser for the 1988 National League Championship Series, but it reminds Boublil of the character Gavroche from the novel. According to Sternfeld, who's relying on the New York Times interview with Boublil, quote, he chose it for its specifically French nature. Quote, within the quote, in order to be able to have musical theater performed in France, a country where the genre does not exist, you have to touch something that is deep in the heart of people and of all quotes. And there's nothing more central to the French culture than the Hugo novel. So there you go. And we'll talk more about that, dive into some of the details a little later on. Okay. So Boublil and Schoenberg now take this idea. We did a rock opera about the French Revolution. Now we're going to do something that is about Les Mis. And they produce a concept album that's mostly just Schoenberg playing the piano and singing. But they're in the music and entertainment biz, so they pitch it around until they find John Cameron. Cameron has been a successful pop artist and producer, and I am most struck by his work with UK funk band Hot Chocolate, who had hits you might remember like, quote, You Sexy Thing, that's their big one, and also those you might have heard of, like the title Heaven is in the Backseat of My Cadillac, which is notable for including the cheesiest pickup line of all time. He also recorded an all-instrumental version of Led Zeppelin's A Whole Lot of Love. So John Cameron is doing a thing that is somewhere between soft rock of the 1970s and Led Zeppelin and Hot Chocolate. But he goes on to work for music and movies and TV as well. He's an established guy by the time he's approached in the late 1970s, and he orchestrates a fully produced version of the concept album. The album cover for that is the Bayard lithograph. That's the picture of Cosette that you've seen a million times. It also appeared in the original novel that Victor Hugo printed, and it is in French. And that's going to become important when we try to figure out what's up with France and the musical production of Les Mis. John Cameron has made their concept album into a fully produced album. They presented to Cameron Mackintosh in 1982, and they already had some interested in the thing becoming a musical, and they even had a small deposit, but Mackintosh convinces the duo that he's the guy to go with. They sign with him, and the plan is to have the show produced by the Royal Shakespeare Company, and then move to London's West End, which is their commercial theater district, roughly the Broadway of London, if you are not familiar with it. Although that sentence surely offends the British, who probably think of Broadway as the lowbrow version of London's West End. Anyway, if you're going to do a musical in the UK, you want to be on the West End. Kind of poking fun there, but the issues do matter. There is a real dispute over art. That is the horrifying dish you serve when you mix art critics, public funding, and capitalism in your microwave and you let it cook for too long. The broad strokes are that things like the Royal Shakespeare Company is a public entity. It is, as the name suggests, commissioned by the royal family, who mostly pays the bills for it. And its job is to culturally elevate the populace by producing great art. And the result is that it has lots of prestige, but not very much money. The West End is commercial, and the critics generally turn up their nose in the way only very British critics can at the rank commercialism and the lowbrow pandering nature of the West End's productions. But that's where the mega musicals are, and that is where the money is. And as Les Mis is coming into being, the fact that all these things are developing at the time of Thatcherism and Reaganomics only makes that dish more, let's call it salty. And we will get to that in our next episode. So the two original creators have found a producer, and they're going to do it with a plan of taking it first to the Royal Shakespeare Company and then to go to the West End. But let us not let this tawdry discussion of mere money distract us from the central spiritual connection here. As we have learned in prior episodes, Victor Hugo started the book Les Mis in the 1840s, but he couldn't finish it because he was run out of France by the tyrannical, soon-to-be emperor Louis Napoleon. Not the Napoleon, who really got things rolling by 1800, but his nephew, who came to power after a few more tries at both kings and democracies in 1850. Hugo was exiled to the island of Jersey, where he held seances, and I'm just reviewing previous episodes here, but his son Charles was the best medium, and through him, William Shakespeare himself appeared from beyond the grave to dictate the first act of a new play. At the same seances, the spirit of civilization told Victor Hugo to finish the Les Mis manuscript, which he would return to 6 years later and finish by 1862. And if that sounds like a third-hand ghost story, you don't have to take my word for it. Hugo's daughter, Adelaide, kept a transcript of every word of the hundreds of seances, and it's available in published form that you yourself can read if you either speak French or have a lot of patience for Google Translate. Where is the Babelfish? Hugo didn't need one because although Hugo could speak no English, William conveniently decided to write his new play in French because he said he preferred that language to English. That does introduce the question of why he did all of his writing in English while he was alive, but the afterlife is all about second chances. Maybe I shouldn't joke. The ghosts aren't real because the one that told Hugo to finish Les Mis was dead on. I didn't even try to do that, but I like dead on as the standard of accuracy for spectral predictions. Anyway, Hugo does Shakespeare a solid by being a vehicle for the great English author to continue his work from beyond the grave. And Shakespeare returns the favor by having the theater company named for him give Hugo's great novel a third life as a successful musical. It's like watching Elton John and Billy Joel go on tour together. Seriously, I think it is just a crazy connection or coincidence or something that Hugo was a huge fan of Shakespeare and that Les Mis, the musical, was started by the Royal Shakespeare Company. But not yet. The original lyricist is named James Fenton, and he gets fired. He's a good poet, but it's taking too long, and the lyrics aren't really come together. That is quite a parallel, by the way, to The Man from La Mancha, which consumes the first 3 episodes of this podcast. Their original lyricist was also a great poet, but was also fired because his lyrics sounded like pretty good poetry, but pretty bad songs. Mackintosh then brings on the relatively unknown Herbert Kretzmer, who's making his way with a day job as a journalist. Now, in past episodes, we've talked about the spiritual content of the original novel. Victor Hugo himself thought his book was highly spiritual, and Kretzmer got that right. He had an interview where he described himself as an atheist, but when penning the lyrics for Jean Valjean's song, he realized that it sounded like a prayer. And he said that he had to believe the spiritual content with every sinew and as fervently as Jean Valjean did. That approach seemed to work. He produced good lyrics, and eventually the musical comes together. Mackintosh brings in Boublil and Schoenberg in a central creative role, which surprises them because they think he's bought the rights and he's just going to do his own adaptation. They add a lot, and there's work to do. In France, you can just assume that everyone knows the Les Mis plot, but there's more to explain to the English audience, including and especially the sewer system. The cast is charged with doing some research so they could better convey ideas. The director is Trevor Nunn. He is also the director at the Royal Shakespeare Company, but controversially is working on Cats, which is fueling the public subsidy and commercialism maelstrom. But it's clear that he's giving Les Mis significant creative input. So that's everything that's going on. They've got a new lyricist. They brought in the original creators of the show. Cameron Mackintosh is producing it, and they've got a director named Trevor Nunn who works for the Royal Shakespeare Company. Finally, the show opens in the Barbican Theater in October of 1985. The Barbican is the official theater of the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's running an insomnia-curing 3.5 hours long. One of the challenges that all adaptations are going to have to deal with is staying true to a 1,500-page book while keeping the audience awake. Just like the original novel, the initial reviews are not good. According both to Sternfeld and an interview with Mackintosh that he gave to journalist Anna Timms, the next day reviews were so bad they were seriously considering letting the show end early at the Barbican and just die a natural death. Those negative reviews will be all about the commercialism debates and high artistry. I should say it sounded less like a major crisis of faith in the production and more like a bad morning, like the early reviews ruined their mood when they first woke up and read them. Among the unimpressed was Andrew Lloyd Webber. He's an owner of the West End Theater, The Palace, which is where Mackintosh wants to take Les Mis after the Royal Shakespeare Company run. And Lloyd Webber offers to return the deposit to take the bite off a show that he thinks will obviously be a failure. But the spirit of Shakespeare will have none of it. Great word of mouth offsets the negative reviews. A few positive and rave reviews show up later, and the show sells out the entire Barbican run. After the bad morning, Mackintosh calls the box office, and the sales were doing fine. The best remedy, as any theater person knows, for a hangover is lots of water, and the best remedy for bad reviews is ticket sales. In fact, they set records for ticket sales for the duration of the Barbican run. They did then move to the Palace and sold out every show until they moved to the Queen's Theater in 2004, and it played there until the theater was refurbished in 2019. It now plays at the Sondheim Theater, where it is still running as of this recording in January of 2025. That is to say that after its run at the Royal Shakespeare, its West End run was a huge success. Lloyd Webber was happy to accept the successful show in the Palace Theater and cash all the checks. The show still has another life. It now needs to jump the Atlantic to get to Broadway. This it will do in March of 1987, so only a couple of years after it opens on the West End, and it does so by breaking all of the advanced ticket sales records of Cats. This time, the reviews are generally positive, although some felt the production was a little bit too much of a good thing. One called it, quote, too inspirational, end quote. The Newsweek reviewer predicted correctly that it would be the most successful show of all time, and unlike the book or the Royal Shakespeare Company's production, the critics were behind this version of the show, the one that appeared on Broadway. There are a few things worth mentioning just about the production overall and all of its incantations on both sides of the Atlantic. Its initial run had 12 Tony nominations. It won 8 of them on Broadway. It now runs about 2 hours and 50 minutes with an intermission, so 40 minutes was shaved off of the original Shakespeare Company rendition. There are fast-paced scene changes and very few applause breaks, which Sternfeld thinks is the key to making really long epic work. Both Sternfeld and a master's student named Mary Pizzillo of Stephen F. Austin University noticed that the show makes extensive use of musical leitmotifs. Those are musical phrases or pieces of music that repeat to bring the audience back to important points. These are used extensively in Phantom of the Opera, but Les Mis actually used them first. And Les Mis, the music is used to mark the ideas, where in the Phantom, it marks the characters. Another item of note is that in the musical, the Thernadiers are presented as comic, and in the closing scene, when all the characters come back from the dead and on the barricades, and a rousing finish, the Thernadiers rise from the stage. This is a different treatment than they have in the book, where they're just kind of the arch villains and they're not comic. For now, I'll just be pointing this out, but we'll talk later about why that might matter. The show makes extensive use of the chorus as vocal contributors. Not all shows do that. That's way more fun if you're a member of the chorus. Every time the show comes out, there's a massive marketing push that precedes its release. Sternfeld notes and points to others who think that a big part of Macintosh's success is his commitment to marketing and how well he does it. It's definitely a mega musical, and it's been called muse derisively by those who think that the artistic quality commercialism dialectic has tipped far too heavily in favor of commercialism, but that's definitely a feature of this show. The show has had an international appeal. It's been adapted in many places and in many different languages. It was advertised in Oslo, where Cosette has a Viking helmet, in Tel Aviv, where she has an Israeli flag, in Australia, where she appears upside down, earmuffs for Reykjavik, and a Mountie uniform for Toronto. There are creative ways that they're advertising the show for each specific location. And of course, there's effective marketing that happens in front of all of them. Stevens and Grossman say that the themes of the show are universal. Let's remember that. And also finds that the emotional themes are transcultural. A variant on this idea is the master's thesis of Kelsey Blair of the University of British Columbia, who finds the theme of empowerment, including power and change, is one that resonates with audiences kind of universally. The political content of the show has also resonated worldwide. Cosette's image has been superimposed on the Solidarity flag during the Polish resistance. There were performances that got dedicated to the protesters in the Tiananmen Square back in 1989. The Les Mis songs were played during Bill Clinton's successful 1992 presidential candidacy, and Macintosh actually asked Trump to take them out of the Trump rallies. And in an issue we will dwell on in the next episode, it opened in 1991 in France, fulfilling Boublil's vision of creating the ultimate French narrative. It wasn't that much of a risk. The show had been a success in 60 other cities already in a bunch of other countries, and it did open to rave reviews and big crowds, which died out after a month. The production lost $3.7 million, and it was the only losing production of the show ever when Sternfeld had printed the book in 2006. It probably still is. The last thing I'll say about this production is that famously and controversially, in 1996, there was a pretty substantial cast turnover. The show had opened in 1987, so it was about a decade in, but the producers had seen a viewing of the show that they felt was stale, so they replaced 12 of the performers on a very large cast. Now, this was obviously bad for the performers, many of whom relied on the paychecks from their mortgages. Most were really hardworking, although they were not necessarily credited. To his credit, Macintosh did give them the maximum severance plus $25,000, which is something, but it definitely was for the good of the show and to the detriment of the performers. And a New York Times reporter noted that the production team was treating the cast as if they were thought of as interchangeable parts, just like Fantine had been in Jean Valjean's factory. This is a theme we will deal with extensively in our very next episode, but Sternfeld estimates that the move worked. It was bad for the performers, and it was good for the show, with the open question being how the moral scales balanced out. And in the introduction of his book, Hugo said that as long as the poor, the young, and the female continue to be exploited, there would be a need for books like Les Mis. Here we are a century and a half later, and part of what Les Mis must mean is that those issues are still with us. What resonated with the audiences of the novel in 1862 is still poignant to the audiences of the musical in 1985, and since the book and the musical are both running strong today, 40 years later in 2025, those issues are still with us. Okay, so how well did this musical work? I will turn to Carly Ann Clements, a writer for the official LondonTheatre.com website, to give us the final box score. According to Clements, it is the longest running musical in the world. It's had 3 Broadway runs. It was the core of Tobe Hooper's 2012 movie, which was produced by Macintosh, that won 3 Oscars. It won 8 of 12 Tonys. It was nominated for on its initial Broadway run. It has had 6,680 performances in Broadway between 1987 and 2003, not counting the runs in the other 44 countries. And just to say it again, a total audience of at least 70 million in 45 countries and 22 languages. More than one author has called it the most successful musical of all time, and I'm not here to argue about that. All that is awesome, but for me, it would have been enough just to have Victor Hugo's famous novel that was first performed as a musical in a theater named after Shakespeare had appeared to Hugo in a seance. That is the tally sheet, but it does not put all of our mysteries to bed. The success of the musical was enormous, but not in France. That would be weird by itself, but it wasn't Boublil's whole point to make the most French thing that he possibly could. Why would it fail in France, of all places? And all the success is making a lot of people really rich, but by dramatizing the lives of the poor. Is that cool? There are a lot of armchair opinions out there and a lot of surprisingly deep economic analyses, and we'll talk about all of it in the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.